We were talking something about the ideas, the life of Abraham Kuyper, the institutions that he founded, but we want to come back and look at those ideas in a lot more detail. What was it that so inspired him? What was it that gripped so many people? What was it that makes Abraham Kuyper still, I think, one of the most useful of Christian thinkers to follow, to meditate on, to help us think through what it means to live as Christians in the modern world? There were several key ideas, I think, to Abraham Kuyper. And one of those key ideas was, he said, we have to decide, whether we're Christians or not, whether the world in which we live is normal or abnormal. Now that seems like such a simple question. It may not even seem like a very helpful question. And yet I think it is wonderfully profound, as many profound ideas are simple. Because what Kuyper is saying when he asks that question is, are the evolutionists right? If the evolutionists are right, the world we live in is normal. All the problems we see are normal. Sickness is normal, death is normal, social injustice is normal. That's what happens when people are evolving from being lower kinds of creatures and trying to overcome their aggressive natures to becoming more civilized. And so if we follow the evolutionary line of thought, this is a normal world in which we live. And Kuyper said, we as Christians must staunchly defend the proposition that the world in which we live is profoundly abnormal. This is a fallen world. This is not the good world as God created it. And our whole orientation to life, all of our thinking, Kuyper said, needs to be directed to this proposition: the world in which we find ourselves is abnormal. And what God intended is something different. What we must pursue is something different, something better. And when you think about it, that's a very important insight. Is death normal? The whole world around about us says, of course, death is just a natural part of life. Hospice, when they come in to your deathbed, will say to you, death is just a natural part of life. And Christians say, no, death is an enemy. Death is the last enemy. Death is the enemy that Christ has conquered in his resurrection and will conquer for us. It's not normal. It's not right. That doesn't mean we can change it, but it means God can change it, and God will change it, and God expects us to recognize it as an enemy. And in that sense, I think I see over and over again in Kuyper a reality that's almost prophetic. It's almost as if he looks forward to the day when the racists will say, it will be normal to get rid of the weaker races. It will be proper for the strongest to survive and the weak to die. And Kuyper's saying, we as Christians have to stand against that kind of thinking. We are the people of life, not the people of death. And in that regard, he really is a very profound thinker. Another element of his thinking that's very important is his insistence that we are a different people as Christians because of the regenerating work of God in our hearts. We are new creations. We are new creatures by the grace of God. And he says, this should change everything about the way we live, everything about the way we think. We are empowered by a new life principle, and that new life principle is not just for personal sanctification, but should spill over into affecting the world around us as well as of ourselves. And he said it's not surprising that non-Christians won't understand the way we think because we think differently, being regenerated by the Spirit of God. And so Kuyper actually would argue that we ought to have a Christian science. Now, he was not reading Mary Baker Eddy. What he meant by that is, as we think scientifically, whether about natural science or other kinds of academic disciplines, we as Christians ought to approach these subjects somewhat differently because we see the world differently. And because we are different people than what we were, it ought to lead to different results. Now, that may be kind of idealistic. It may be a little optimistic in some regards, but he said that should be our goal, that the fact that we are new creatures should lead us to be different. And that means we have to understand there is a fundamental antithesis between us and the world. That was one of Kuyper's favorite words, antithesis. He may have stolen it from Hegel, but he gave it its own twist. We do not just live peaceably in this world, but we recognize there is a spiritual battle, a spiritual difference that puts us at odds with the world. Some of you may know a college in northwest Iowa by the name of Dordt College, and it was founded by very strong Kuyperians. And when they thought of a mascot, they decided they would be known as the Dordt Defenders, very much in the spirit of Abraham Kuyper. And their school colors initially were black and white. Now there's a great kind of Kuyperian assertion. There's an antithesis that runs between Christians. We're different. At the same time, Kuyper said, but how do we account for the fact that non-Christians do so many things that are good, so many things that are useful, so many things that are beautiful? Isn't that true? There are all sorts of non-Christians with all sorts of abilities. We would all rather have a non-Christian surgeon who's a really good surgeon than a Christian surgeon who's not a very hot surgeon. We'd rather go to church maybe with a Christian surgeon, but we want the good surgeon cutting us open. And Kuyper said, we shouldn't be surprised at that because God has preserved the unregenerate by his common grace. That was a phrase of Kuyper's, common grace. The preserving work of God amongst the unregenerate so that they can write beautiful books, compose beautiful symphonies, be skilled as surgeons, accomplish all sorts of things. They don't do that because of their own inherent ability. They don't do that because some part of them is unfallen. They do that only because God has preserved them and given them his common blessings to sustain them. And I think this is a profound insight on Kuyper's thought. Thomas Aquinas, when he tried to account for the accomplishments of the unregenerate, divided the world into nature and grace. And he said, well, there's a part of nature that's not really completely fallen and destroyed, and that enables people to do all kinds of praiseworthy, admirable, beautiful things. And Kuyper said, no, it's not uncorrupted nature that allows that to happen. It's God's preserving, active work that keeps people from being as bad as they would otherwise be. And he said, in order to understand the dynamics of human reality, we really have to understand that dynamic of antithesis and common grace as the way in which human experience and history moves. So that's another of those really profound thoughts of his. It's part of the reason that he thought we needed a Christian university so that Christians can gather together and think together. But perhaps the most useful, the most practical of his ideas is an idea he initially developed at the founding of the Free University of Amsterdam in 1880 and was his address at the founding of the university, his speech, which was a speech on the sovereignty of spheres in their own area, what comes to be known as sphere sovereignty. And this, I really think, is one of his genius moments and also prophetic moments. As Kuyper looked around at history and at contemporary society, he said, you know, in Western history, there has always been, up till the present, a great struggle between the church and the state for domination. Big part of medieval history is the Pope versus the Emperor for domination. But Kuyper said in our day, in the latter part of the 19th century, the church is clearly in retreat as an institution in terms of social power. And what does that mean? It means that all power in society is passing to the hands of the state. And Kuyper already in the 19th century said, the great problem Western society is going to face is utter state control and domination of all of life. He really was, I think, prophetic in seeing the tendencies in European society that would lead to both fascism and communism in the 20th century. And both fascism and communism, though in different ways, are utterly statist in their view of power and control in society. The state is in control of everything. And Kuyper said, that is not a Christian way of seeing reality. That is not a Christian way of organizing reality. But what's the alternative? Well, there were Calvinists in the Netherlands who said, well, the alternative is to go back and make the Reformed Church dominant again and legal again and in control again. We'll go back to the Middle Ages. And Kuyper said, that's never going to happen. And we don't even want it to happen. It wasn't a good thing. The answer to state control is not a pope. The answer to state control, Kuyper said, is to recognize that God created this world with a variety of areas or spheres, as he put it, of responsibility directly responsible to God. And he said, the state often acts as if it's the only area of responsibility directly responsible to God. Now, Kuyper said, we need the state. God created the state. The state is a good thing. But God did not give to the state all power in society. The state is there to administer justice in society. That's the limit of its responsibility. And God gave to other areas of society or other spheres of society responsibilities directly accountable to God. And Kuyper said one of the most important, one of the most foundational is the family. The state didn't create the family. Now, under communism, communism wanted to say the state did create the family. The state controlled the family. The family existed only insofar as it was accountable to the state. Kuyper said that's absolutely wrong. God did not give children to the state. God gave children to the family. And the family has a responsibility before God to raise the children. And Kuyper said no one should interfere with that family right and responsibility to raise children. The family is the sphere of love and of child rearing. Now, Kuyper recognized that there might be times when a family is physically abusing a child, where the state, in the name of justice, has to intervene. But he said, the authority to raise children is not given to the state, but is given to the family. And he said, what is the implication of that for education? He said the implication of that for education is that it is not the state that runs schools to educate children. It's parents who need to run schools to educate children. And Kuyper said, look, we live in a modern world. Not everyone will want to send their children to the Reformed Christian school. Kuyper would have said they should, but not everyone will. And we should not interfere with the rights of parents to educate their children as they see best. And Kuyper said, we are laboring not just so that the Reformed parents will have tax money to build Reformed schools for their children, but we are laboring so that Roman Catholic parents will get money to build Roman Catholic schools to educate their children. And Jewish parents will get money to build Jewish schools to educate their children. Now you see how radical a notion this is in a Europe still with remnants of Christian civilization, still with strong notions of single control. And Kuyper saying, no, we need a genuine pluralism that honors genuinely the diversity that should exist in society so that there is genuine freedom. Jewish parents should not be coerced and denied the right to raise their children. Now, he believed in evangelism. He wanted to see evangelism happen. But he says, it is not the right of the state or the right of the church to tell parents how to raise their children. And I think this is a really profound and important insight as a foundation of genuine freedom in society. He said, of course, God has established the church. The church is the repository of truth and of faith. But in a modern society, we have to leave space for a variety of churches to exist. He said it's a kind of romantic, nostalgic notion to think that we want one true church. Because the likelihood is the one true church that will be imposed upon us isn't the church we actually want to belong to. And Kuyper said there has to be freedom for a multiplicity of churches, for a multiplicity of family notions of raising children, and therefore a multiplicity of schools, and a multiplicity of political parties to help determine the character of the state. And I think this notion of spheres by Kuyper is one of the potential great bulwarks against tyranny in the modern world. Now you can say, well, how well has it worked? Well, it worked somewhat well in the Netherlands. It didn't defeat communism in Russia or anything, but we're talking now about great ideas and great ideals and great goals that are being laid out. And one of the issues we as Christians are constantly being confronted with today is, how can you claim to know the only truth? How can you claim to serve the only God and still survive in a pluralistic society? Aren't you necessarily, Christians, theocrats? Don't you necessarily want to persecute everybody who disagrees with you? And I think the brilliance of Kuyper is to say, here's a way forward where we do not compromise our commitments to truth, but we find a way to develop a pluralistic society where we can live with one another without violating one another's conscience, without violating one another's abilities to live according to truth. And I think if we were more Kuyperian in America, in our thinking, we'd be saved from some of our problems. Because Kuyper would look at America today. He really loved America. He visited America only once, and when he got to America in New York, Teddy Roosevelt was governor, and the other candidate for governor was also of Dutch descent. And he thought, this must be a wonderful place, being run by Dutchmen. And he visited Michigan, visited Iowa in Dutch communities, and he must have thought, my young son once said, why are there so many Dutch people in the world? And I said, it's not that there are actually that many Dutch people, we just know them all. He thought America was wonderful, but in his analysis, he said, the polar opposite today in Western society, meaning late 19th century, is this tendency to the authoritative, tyrannical state on the one hand, or utterly radical individualism on the other hand. And part of what we see in America today is a radical individualism that is increasingly becoming intolerant. Because it's an individualism that says you can't have your own schools, you can't have your own families, you can't have your own religion. You have to function in a society where every individual is equally respected in every institution. And I think Kuyper had an antidote for that too. If you want to raise your children in a certain radically liberal mental state, you could have schools for that. But leave our schools alone. Leave our children alone. And so Kuyper, I think, is the great modern thinker in his ability to encourage us to a genuinely tolerant, pluralistic society in which there's freedom, and at the same time in which Christians are free to build the schools and the institutions that they need. Interestingly, Kuyper said another sphere is the sphere of science and of advanced thought. And he said that's where universities should come from. He said universities shouldn't be controlled by the state. Universities shouldn't be controlled by the family. Universities shouldn't be controlled by the church. Universities should be places of scholars gathering together. So there should be Christian universities where Christian scholars can gather, and there could be other kinds of universities. But they need to be places of advanced thought. And again, I think this is really fairly profound, quite helpful. And I think Kuyper is not a perfect teacher. People have criticized some of his ideas. There were problems in society. People used to say, well, Kuyper led to the pillarization of Dutch society, so that you could be born in a Reformed hospital, go to the Reformed kindergarten, go to the Reformed grammar school, go to the Reformed high school, go to the Reformed university, marry, of course, a Reformed girl, live in the Reformed church, be part of the Reformed labor union, and be buried in the Reformed cemetery. Now, that could be a problem if you became so isolated that you almost had no contact with other members of society. But I don't think that's likely to happen in America. Maybe in Grand Rapids. But generally speaking, it's not going to happen in America. And yet, the idea of freedom from state tyranny and from freedom from the individual tyranny really is a brilliant analysis of society, of the functioning of institutions. Kuyper spawned not only institutions, but any number of brilliant thinkers along with him. The great theologian Herman Bavinck, that wrote one of the finest systematic theologies of the early 20th century. A great variety of biblical scholars. There was a great flowering of piety, of devotion, of scholarship, and great things were accomplished. But great things don't always last. And much of what Kuyper accomplished in the Netherlands would be lasting 50, 70 years and then begin to go into decline. Walter Lippmann would coin the phrase, the acids of modernity. And one of the problems we seem to face in the modern world is that the dominant culture has acids in it that eat away at our Christian convictions, our Christian institutions, our Christian experiences. It's very sad on one hand. On the other hand, we could say it keeps us turning to the Lord. It keeps us relying on the Lord. It reminds us that our times are in His hands and that all of our hopes, all of our accomplishments are only by His grace and by His accomplishment. It might even keep us praying, and that's not a bad thing. And so as we conclude this time of looking at the 19th century, where I feel like we've had the barest taste of what we might have studied, might have reflected on, new challenges for the church, new strength for the church, new insights for the church, and always new needs to be faithful, to be encouraged, to be renewed in commitment. Thank you so much for being here.